Are you sitting comfortable, 2 square on your body? Then we'll begin.
July 1965, 4 young mods from the East End of London entered this studio in West Hampstead. The result would be the R&B pop phenomenon known as the Small Faces. Over the next 3 years, the group would release a series of groundbreaking singles that would come to define an era.
If any band really sums up the 60s, more than the Stones, the Who, or even the Beatles, the Small Faces were the ultimate 60s supergroup.
I think what was really special about the Small Faces was their ability to take these most disparate elements and mould them together, to take their East End culture and place it with R&B music and make it work.
This film is a critical review of 9 classic singles and the band behind them.
Am I going to mug you?
Is that gorgeous or what, eh?
And I believe I can run a decent marathon.
Thank you very much.
Download Veely now.
The Small Faces story begins in 1965 in the East End of London, when Ronnie Lane and Steve Marriott met in the J60 music bar. The pair quickly recruited Jimmy Winston and Kenny Jones to form a 4-piece that began to work on a heavily R&B-influenced set of songs.
The biggest thing that happened to Britain musically in the early 60s was American R&B music. Every group that formed in Britain at that time wanted to play R&B music. Everybody wanted to sing like an Otis Redding or a James Brown. R&B music was the foundation upon what every group was based on. Whether it be the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, who covered early Motown songs on their first album. It was the most glamorous, it was the most hip, it was the most mysterious music. Obviously, you had an audience, a young audience, who were growing up on this music, who were mods. They were young, working-class kids who were obsessed with this music and obsessed with clothes as well. And the two came together to create the mod scene.
What you hear with the Small Faces when they started is it's Memphis out of the East End, really. They're looking at Booker T and the MGs and that Stax sound. At the same time, they were very influenced by the Who. So I guess what you've got is Booker T and the MGs meet the Who.
It was always the aim from day one, you know, to get as close to Booker T and the MGs as possible.
What they did, being innovators and also sort of thieves in some respects, but they stole from the Kinks and the Who, and that's where the crashing guitar sounds and also the harmonies that later came in. So basically, they were an eclectic band. They drew from all sources.
Within 5 months of forming, the Small Faces were signed to a management contract with the infamous Don Arden. who in turn got the band a recording contract with Decca Records.
Signing with Don Arden, yeah, the boys were very, very excited. Don Arden was a big man in town, possibly the biggest manager, if not in the whole country, certainly in London, you know.
The infamous Don Arden, who I always thought actually was a little bit of a fake, because he has this reputation, of course, of being a gangster. But he wasn't a real gangster. He wasn't tough enough to have been a real gangster, you know. When you meet the real guys out in the States, and then you know what you're up against.
If I've ever exploited anybody, it's for their own benefit. It's because they want to be exploited. I never exploit anybody that doesn't want to be exploited. There's no point to it. You could never be successful in exploiting an artist or a group of artists who don't want to be exploited.
Don Arden could actually, as well as digging the band in terms of the music, you know, he could also see the fact that he had a band that looked almost manufactured. I mean, they weren't, but they looked it, you know. The band also had something else which was very special. I mean, they looked the part. I mean, London in 1965, the whole swinging London scene was just sort of blossoming with Carnaby Street, King's Road, the whole mod thing. I mean, the mod thing was really, really big in those days.
Eager to launch his new band, Don Arden decided to bring in established songwriters Samwell and Potter to write lyrics to a Steve Marriott composition. What you gonna do about it?
Marriott had nicked this riff from Solomon Burke, from Everybody Needs Somebody to Love. And he'd nicked the riff, and so they based their first single, What You Gonna Do About It, around this riff. So it had that, it was a pop song, but it had that R&B connotation to it.
The thing about What You're Going to Do About It was you could tell the influence of American R&B bands, in particular Booker T and the MGs. It's pretty obvious that Steve Marriott and the rest of the guys were heavily influenced by Booker T and the MGs. And in particular, you can hear the influence of the guitarist Steve Cropper on What You're Going to Do About It, and the kind of licks, the solo, and some of the chordal stuff that Steve Marriott plays in that song.
Yes, What You're Going to Do About It was basically quite simple, but it had tremendous impact because of the driving performance right from the get-go. You get Kenny Jones triplets on the snare drum blasting his way into a piece which is full of feedback. You listen to it now, it's quite a crude production.
It was a fantastic debut single. It still sounds great today. It's got a raw energy, and it's almost impossible to think that Marriott was about 18 years old. Close your eyes and, you know, he's a 50-year-old black man singing.
The fact that he's 17, 18 and he's singing like he's 30 years old. It's a great vocal performance on that. He's got that R&B thing, you know, really down pat.
There she is. Come on up. Hello. What's your name?
Kathy Bozeman.
Kathy. Look over there. There we are.
Hello.
Good night, Kathy. Pass on a frog on Steve. Come on over, Steve.
Hello.
Say hello. What do you want to ask him?
I'd like to know how long that their group has been together and how they got together.
Wie lang ist die Gruppe zusammen und wie sie zusammengekommen sind, Steve?
Well, we've been together for 1 year now, exactly 1 year. and we all got together in a pub.
Aha. Sie sind zusammen in ein
What You Gonna Do About It was released on the 6th of August 1965. It reached number 14 in the charts, although not without a helping hand from the band's management.
Arden then went out and hyped What You Gonna Do About It into the charts, which he's very open about. He sent out all his minions. They all bought 20 copies of the single in record shops all over London, and before you know it, bang, the Small Faces are in the top 20. And of course, with the top 20 single, press comes, TV comes, radio comes, and suddenly the band, within 6 months of forming, were in the top 20.
However, even as their debut climbed the charts, there were problems developing within the band itself. Organist Jimmy Winston was about to leave the burgeoning pop group.
40 years on, it's still not totally clear what the reason was. I mean, I've spoken to Jimmy, I've spoken to other guys in the band, and you still get the stories of the fact that he was sacked because he was 2 inches too tall and all that. I think Don Arden wanted Jimmy out as much as the band. Don Arden realised that Jimmy was more, being that bit older, was more streetwise, and Jimmy was asking questions about, where the money was going, whereas the others weren't quite so interested at the time. So it was decided between the band and Don Arden that Jimmy had to go, and it was all done a little bit sneakily, really. Jimmy wasn't really told that he was out of the band. In fact, they brought in... The strange thing was that Don Arden was also dealing with another band called the Boz People at the time, and there was a picture of Ian McLagan in a magazine, a full-page colour picture, Ian McLagan, the Boz People. In fact, it wasn't Ian McLagan at all, it was Boz, out of Boz, the Boz People. But they thought, well, this guy looks the part. He was obviously a very good musician. He'd been around a little bit longer than the other guys. And it was decided to bring Ian McLagan into the band in place of Jimmy.
With Ian McLagan installed behind the keyboard, the band prepared for the release of their second single, a Small Faces original, I've Got Mine. However, it was not to equal the success of What You Gonna Do About It.
And now, just back from their fabulous American tour, the Small Faces.
I Got Mine was too dark for, for What You're Going to Do About It to I Got Mine. It's a very kind of, it's a much darker sort of record, more measured and more kind of threatening in many respects. So that failed, at which point Don Arden said, we can't have you failing. We've built up this momentum, we got you into the charts. I'm going to bring in Mort Schumann and Kenny Lynch, and they're going to give you a song, which they did, and that song was called Sha-La-La-La-Lee. And the band hated it, but for the sake of, for fame or success, bowed down to Arden's wishes, recorded it, put it out, and it put them straight back into the charts.
Marriot was obviously really pissed off at having to play the song. So you can hear the venom in his guitar part. He really attacks the guitar. He took a lot of flack for it. In retrospect, it is actually a very good performance, and it's a great song anyway. But his guitar playing is just, it's typical mod for that period. Really angry, power chord stuff, but you can hear the kind of venom he puts into it.
It is a pretty dreadful song, actually. Steve Marriott used to later refer to it as a Walt Disney song or a Mickey Mouse song. And I think you can even hear Kenny Lynch's voice in the chorus there, which they weren't very happy about. But of course it was a big hit.
They certainly brought their own sound into it, and there's still quite a bit of sort of thrashing guitar and thrashing drums in it. They weren't going to let Arden get away just with having a sweet pop song. So it's got their stamp on it, but object to that, the tune, it doesn't sort of fit that well with their sound. But as far as the pop buying public were concerned, it was, you know, it was a very easily listenable song.
What Sha-La-La-La-Lee did was that it took away their male audience and replaced it with a female audience. Suddenly the Small Faces were not a hard-nosed R&B edged group, but a pop phenomenon. Everywhere they went, girls screamed at them. They were, you know, they would walk out on stage to play. These girls would be there. They would just start screaming. The band couldn't hear themselves play. Within 2 songs, the girls had taken the stage anyway. The band would have to run out to cars to get them away before being ripped apart by these girls.
There's no way that you could decipher what the band were playing. You know, the hysteria totally sort of blocked out the music. I mean, it was Beatlemania all over again. I mean, the guys couldn't jump on a bus or walk down the street anymore. You know, it really was Beatlemania all over again. They were that big. I mean, during 1966, Steve in particular was probably the biggest mod icon in the world. You know, I mean, shops in Carnaby Street were actually selling Steve Marriott wigs.
It was actually the start of their downfall, even though they had another 3-4 years to go and another 2 or 3 albums to make and loads of hit singles to have. It was actually part of the start of the downfall because fame and that kind of fame ran totally counter to what they were trying to do. Here's Steve Marriott trying to be Booker T and the MGs, and in reality, they'd take that.
By now, Arden had moved the band into a house in Pimlico. Only Kenny had remained in the East End with his parents. It was here that the Small Faces began work on their first LP.
I recall when I used to go around to the house that, I mean, the thing that immediately struck you was the energy levels that were abundant. You know, I thought it was bags of energy. Actually, probably what there was bags of amphetamine.
Well, the band were living at Westmoreland Terrace together, and in 1966, the first album was released, simply titled Small Faces on Decca. And that was fairly successful, really. I mean, one of the ironic things about that is the fact that Jimmy Winston actually plays on several of those tracks, even though Ian McLagan's picture is on the front of the sleeve, because by the time the album was released, Jimmy was history, and that they had to go with the current lineup. But Jimmy actually features on more of the album than Mac, actually. Not on all of it, but a big chunk of it anyway.
Well, the first Decca album it's an R&B, you know, jamboree. It's, you know, it's them just going mad on, you know, with. So like I said before, it's their R&B influences. It's them trying to be Booker T and the MGs, but a London version of it.
The band had already released their 4th single, Hey Girl, which, although a Marriott and Lane composition, followed in the pop tradition of Sha-La-La-La-Lee. However, the group's next single was to firmly establish them as much more than simply a pop group.
After Sha-La-La-Lee, there was no way that they were going to do another Sha-La-La-La-Lee. So they had to come up with something which would take them to where they wanted to be, but also satisfy the record company and the management. And that song was All or Nothing, which is basically a Steve Marriott song.
But now I see you don't
or Nothing's a great, it's a fantastic leap forward, because it actually gives the Small Faces their own sound and their own style, and it uses a lot of their a lot of techniques which they would utilise later on. The stopping and the starting, the use of backing vocals, which was obviously an R&B influenced technique. Starting off a song with just a guitar melody and then taking it here and taking it into places you wouldn't expect it to go.
All or Nothing is a classic example of less is more. Using a simple D shape, Marriott just builds up the melody of the song, even just with picking through the song. It's very simple. It's 2 chords.
Things could work out just like I want them to, yeah. If I could have the other half of you.
It shows Steve's writing talent to its best. His vocal is fantastic on it. The band are really playing beautifully, I think, together on it. It's just a fantastic hit single, and it's still a fantastic hit single today. I mean, it actually stands the test of time.
All or Nothing was the one. It was their first #1. It was the record that really launched them. It was written by the band, so it helped establish them as a songwriting force as well. I think after that, it was going to be very hard for Don Arden to foist Kenny Lynch on them again. So it's really the one that opened the doors, and you listen to it today, and it still sounds absolutely fantastic.
All or Nothing must be, I guess, everybody's favourite Small Faces track, in the sense that it's a perfect performance. There's no kind of nobody cuts any corners on it. It's not a compromise in any way. It's their heart and soul really goes into that. And Steve Marriott sings so committed. His voice is his vocal performance is so committed to the lyric, and it really is all or nothing.
All or Nothing became the Small Faces' biggest hit, reaching #1 in the charts. Despite their success, the band's relationship with their manager, Don Arden, was getting progressively more hostile.
Because the thing you have to remember is that groups at those times, they put a single out every 3 months. You had to put a single out, and by singles you lived or died. If you were, the higher you were in the singles charts, that's where your status in the pop world was. That's why the Beatles were the #1 group, because they always had #1s, and the Stones were behind them. So, there was this constant pressure to come up with hit single, hit single, hit single. And because the Small Faces were busy touring, or if they weren't busy touring, they were down Carnaby Street kicking themselves out, the pressure on them to deliver music was quite intense. And they kind of, because they'd written stuff like All or Nothing, I think they felt they wanted to take it at their own pace. They wanted to direct their own music. They didn't want people going, hit single, hit single. So the relationship with Arden was severed. It just created a barrier between him and the band, which was never going to be healed. That was it. So the Small Faces left Decca and Arden, and after a sort of little bit of a roundabout, they ended up with Andrew Loog Oldham's immediate label, which was a great place for them to go, because Loog Oldham was not old school. Don Arden was old school. Don Arden was, you do this, you do that. Whereas Andrew Loog Oldham was, here boys, here's a studio. If you make a record, great. If you don't, you don't. He was very laissez-faire like that, Oldham.
During the changeover period from Decca to Immediate, one of the very first tracks recorded for Immediate well, two tracks, actually I Can't Make It and a track called Just Passing. They were actually leased back to Decca, and Decca put the single out in '66 against the wishes of the band, really. You know, they were just trying to keep the momentum going a little bit. The Small Faces themselves never recognised the single and never promoted it in any way whatsoever. But it's a great track. It's just a shame because, you know, had it not come during that changeover period, it could have been possibly one of their biggest hits.
These are the Small Faces. Felt that way too. So don't get hung up, 'cause it's healing. And I'm gonna help you through it all. Listen, baby, I can make it if you can. I can take it if you can. I know that your heart's strong. I know that you'll hold on. I can't make it without you. I can't make it without you. So open up your mind as well as your heart. I can't go on knowing you're not near me. No.
I think I Can't Make It was a kind of signal to their, you know, R&B fans, you know, that they were still into this. They were still part of their canon, you know. I love I Can't Make It. I think it's great. It's that beautiful mix of pop and soul. In fact, they got banned, didn't it? Because the BBC thought it was about the art of what goes on between a man and a woman.
The intriguing question about I Can't Make It is why on earth the BBC banned it. It seems so innocent today. And indeed, there were other Small Faces songs that were far more risque or controversial, that the BBC seemed to miss those references. But they did ban it. It came out on Decca, so the Small Faces themselves weren't really promoting it, because by this time they'd already moved to Immediate. So it's a kind of betwixt and between record.
I Can't Make It came out in March 1967. And in a way, I suppose this particular song marks the end of an era in the Small Faces' career, because it was probably the last of their pure soul performances as a hit single. Indeed, it wasn't quite such a big hit single. It only got to 26 in the chart, which was surprising.
I can't make it without you. You know it's true, girl. You know it's true, girl. I can't make it without you. Get yourself together, under control, and take me before my desire gets older.
The move to Oldham's Immediate records had coincided with a shift in style within the band, which was centred around the growing psychedelic movement and the group's taste in narcotics.
It is very interesting with the Small Faces to see how the music is affected by the drugs du jour at that point in time. They've moved from amphetamines, which was the Purple Hearts, the mod drug, very associated with the R&B sound, that kind of edginess and so on. And then they move into this acid, LSD influence phase. And you know, the music is quite different. There's this psychedelic influence. And at this point, they lose some of the mod fans, who by this stage are probably becoming skinheads and moving on to reggae anyway. And the Small Faces become a hippie band, although they're never quite a hippie band. There's a certain innocence about the clothes and the look, and they somehow still manage to be a pop band trying to be hippies than, you know, full-flown hippies with flowers in their hair and trailing clouds of ganja.
Well, LSD had changed them. LSD had made them get into sounds, and, you know, if you read the interviews around that time, you know, in Disc and Echo, you know, you'll have Steve Merritt going, yeah, we were at this airport the other day and we all started playing on glasses, you know, some of the waters are full in one glass and not so full in the other, and yeah, we think we might put that on our next album. There's a man who hasn't been taking LSD, do you know what I mean? I mean, they were really getting into that whole, you know, sounds thing, you know, of kind of They really liked LSD. They thought it was a great drug, and they kind of wanted to represent that in their music. Because a thing about the Small Faces, especially Marriot, he always wrote about what was going on with him.
The first single to reflect this new sensibility was also to be their first release on Immediate.
Here Comes the Nice is, if you like, the bridging single between the passing of the Decca, as we were talking about, the Decca R&B, hard-hitting, almost solely R&B singles, and going into a much more experimental, free-form, less live, more to do with working in the studio, which is what actually happened. They played live a lot less. They were on Immediate, they were given a lot more time in the studio to do whatever they liked, and of course what that means is also experimenting with all kinds of substances.
It's one of those singles which you see the transition from a year before, when they're doing pretty much R&B driven music, into this very overt psychedelia. And when you think about it, Here Come the Nice is probably the most overt drug song that Britain has ever produced. I mean, the Beatles had to dress it up with Day Tripper or Yellow Submarine or Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds to get a drug message across. The Small Faces just said, you know, fuck it, we're going to say some speed, you know. And that was, when you look back at it, even something like the Shaman's Ebenezer Goods, you know, pales into the overtness of that song.
Well, I mean, Here Comes the Nice was a cod on Lord Buckley's Naz. Here comes, you know, the Naz, the Nazarene, and also Steve's favourite word for being stoned, nice, and it was also about the dealer, of course. I mean, I come back to that thing. It was amazing. He got away with a lot of it because, I mean, everybody that I knew in that period of time, even in that quite naive period of the early 60s, knew that he was talking about drugs and taking drugs and drug experiences. Somehow, in interviews, he would get away with saying, well, I'm just talking about having a good time or something. Go, oh yeah, you know?
He makes me feel like no one else could. He knows what I want, he's got what I need. He's always there if I need some speed. Here come the night, it's understood. Here come the night, it makes me feel so good. I'd be just like him if I only could. You know you should meet the man. The man gonna help you all he can. You don't need money to be wise. Here come the night.
That single is really interesting because it still has some of the elements of the Decca years, but certainly says, hey, this is where we're going to go towards the more well-known Immediate singles like Lazy Sunday, Tin Soldier, Itchycoo Park. They were much more successful singles. We were talking about balance and tension within the band and within Marriot himself because of his character. And Here Comes the Nice really displays that, where it comes in and his vocals are very very poppy, very nice. And it uses the word nice. Here comes the nice. But then you start realising, wait a minute, this is about drugs. It's very explicit. It is about drugs. And they got away with it. And then you listen to his intonation of his voice as you go through the verses, and he's getting nastier and nastier. This guy's cool. And so is Marriot on that song.
Because what you have to understand is that the Small Faces now wanted to be taken seriously. What they were doing was just as inventive as any other group, I would contend. And they wanted to be taken as seriously as the Beatles, the Stones, you know, Dylan, all of whom 66 were absolute key years. You know, Blonde on Blonde, you know, you had Revolver, you know, and these people were, oh my God, these, you know, and the Small Faces wanted some of that. But because they had this kind of irresistible humour going on, they weren't being taken seriously. So when they put out a record like Here Comes the Nice, he's always there when I need some speed, nobody kind of caught on to it. So they're trying to kind of get into the hip culture, to get accepted within this hip culture, and everybody thinks they're a bit of oh yeah, those Cockney guys, you know, the East End funny guys, yeah, they're all right, they.
3 weeks after the release of Here Comes the Nice on the 24th of June, the band's first immediate album was released.
Well, the second Small Faces album, strangely enough, that was, as with the first, was called simply Small Faces, and on the immediate record label in 1967. Many fans consider that to be their finest work, even though Ogden's was the big one, the one that was #1 for weeks on end. You know, many fans regard the first immediate album to be perhaps even stronger.
I think it's fantastic, that song, that album. It's about 30 minutes long and it feels like 80. It's so full of ideas and arranged from the way it's arranged and this amazing sort of mix where they're putting together East End humour with American R&B music and it fitting, somehow it all fitting together with kind of very, you know, using different instruments, different elements, you know. I think that's their masterwork.
The biggest change with the first immediate album, as opposed to the first Decca album, and also the early singles, was the fact that Ronnie was much more prolific now with his writing. And also Ronnie features on pretty much 50% of lead vocals on that album as well, you know. So it was certainly the coming of age of Ronnie Lane.
The group's next single was to be another pro-drug song. This release, however, would go on to become a true classic of the 1960s.
Over bridge of sights, to rest my eyes in shades of green, under dreaming spires, to Itchycoo Park, that's where I've been. What did you do there? I got high. What did you feel there? Well, I cried. But why the tears there? Tell you why. It's all too beautiful. It's all too beautiful. It's all too beautiful. It's all too beautiful. I feel inclined to blow my mind. Get off me the ducks with a bun. They all come out to groove about, be nice and have fun.
To me, Itchycoo Park was just great knockabout pop, you know, and it was fun, and it was very much Ronnie and Ronnie's type of humour, and I think Steve changed a bit of the middle of the song by speeding things up, and I think that was his contribution. I mean, a lot of the stuff they wrote separately. You know, they didn't sort of sit down. I mean, it's the same for practically any great writing partnership that you can think of. Lennon and McCartney, Jagger and Richards, and they all kind of like, they'd have a song, you bring the demo, what do you think of this? Well, you might add this, you could change that, we could change the middle eight, you know, and all of a sudden it becomes a Lennon and McCartney number rather than a Paul McCartney number, which it probably actually really was, and the same thing is true of the Marriott Lane compositions to a large extent. There are one or two where it feels like they might have worked more closely on than, but by and large you can say, well, that's Marriott, that's Lane, you know, and Itchycoo Park was very much Ronnie Lane.
Itchycoo Park was mainly Ronnie's song, and Steve came in with the All Too Beautiful chorus, but it's mainly Ronnie's song. Great record, loads of lovely sound effects, sort of, you know, phasing effects, drum loops, things that were very much of the time. You know, psychedelia was taking over London, it was taking over the world, you know, and the Small Faces were very much sort of part of that scene in 1967. Itchycoo Park was a very clever record. You know, it was one of the first records to introduce some of those sound effects.
Special effects they used on that, like phasing on the drums and on the keyboards as well, were all rather part and parcel of the success of Itchycoo Park. It's just such a unique sound, and it made it such a huge hit. Yeah, #1.
It's all too beautiful. It's all too beautiful. It's all too beautiful. Ha! It's all too beautiful. 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 It's all too beautiful.
I think Itchycoo Park is probably their psychedelic masterpiece. I mean, it's very clever sonically. It's one of the first records that use phasing in that way. The lyric is very interesting. Again, there's a certain English whimsy in there as well. You know, there's a reference to feeding buns to the ducks or whatever it is. And there was that strong sort of Lewis Carroll whimsical element in a lot of psychedelia. Syd Barrett had it as well, for example. And it's very strong in that song. And it's one of those records that I think every time you hear it, certainly if you were alive at that time, it automatically evokes the time in which it was made. I mean, anybody who was around in 1967, I don't think you can hear that record and not be taken back there.
Because Itchycoo Park was actually banned by the BBC. When it was first sent up to the BBC, they went, "There's no way we're playing this," because the lyrics, "I get high." So they had to come up with a story. Now, there's two conflicting things. Tony Calder told me that they came up with Itchycoo Park as a kind of play area where they played as kids, but there wasn't actually a place called that. That it was actually something that they made up. No, it's all right. It's Itchycoo Park. We played there as kids. And when we were on the swings, that's when we got high. This is and the BBC went, "Oh, really? Okay, old chap. Okay, fine." And put it out.
It was also the band's one and only hit single in America, which is rather shocking, really, the fact that they ignored all those marvellous records that the Small Faces were making. But it was a brilliant production, great performance too, although some people have said that it kind of tarred them with this brush of being a novelty band, sort of jolly, sort of cockney sort of band, musical kind of vibe to it, sort of Chaz and Dave of the 60s in one respect.
Their next single, Tin Soldier, saw the band returning to their R&B roots.
The Tin Soldier was a number 9 hit, but I feel it should have been a number 1. I'm sure most people feel that today because it remains one of the high points in the Small Faces' career, and probably one of Steve Marriot's best compositions, because it has that kind of, interestingly enough, there's quite a strong literary reference to it, with the thought about Hans Christian Andersen and a little line at the beginning about wanting to be the tin soldier thrown in the fire. I think that's a gripping kind of opening line, and that helps to make Tin Soldier. It sets it aside, really. It's not just yet another pop single. There's something rather special about it.
Tin Soldier is probably one of Steve Marriot's greatest songs, but it's also a great showcase for the style and the taste of his guitar playing. He was never one to overplay. Some of the licks, like one of the opening licks in the intro of the song, it's just classic Marriott, and it really sets up the tension in the song. And it's one of those songs that builds almost a climax, and it's still one of the greatest things he ever did.
Soldier is the record on which They actually bring the two elements of what they did together. They'd had a couple of these psychedelic singles that had perhaps lost some of their old fans, and Tin Soldier was the one where they seemed to get back that kind of grittier R&B, more soulful sound. And I think, you know, as an exercise in psychedelic soul almost, it's a wonderful piece of music.
As the Small Faces continued to draw various influences into their music, a very traditional East End music hall sound began to appear in their work. None more so than in their 12th single, Lazy Sunday.
I remember the first time I heard Lazy Sunday, and I heard that voice, and I immediately thought The Artful Dodger in Oliver, which my parents had taken me to see in 1960 when I was 6 years old, and we then bought, or my parents bought the original cast recording on LP. And I heard that record, and I heard Steve Marriott singing, and I thought, this sounds like The Artful Dodger. And then, it was only then that I discovered he had actually played The Artful Dodger, and I had seen him at 6 years old, and yet I'd recognised this kind of 12, 13-year-old voice when he was playing that role as the same voice on this record. And it's absolutely there, you know, the Cockney persona, very recognisably.
Lazy Sunday started off as a blues song, and it was just a kind of work in progress. It was a kind of 12-bar blues which Marriott was fooling around with. Then he read an interview with by the Hollies, and one of the Hollies was moaning about Marriott not singing in his English voice, that he sounds too American. So he thought, okay, you want English? I'll give you English. And that is why he sings the song in, you know, that broad Cockney accent.
But they make it very clear they've got no room for ravers. They stop me from grooving, they bang on me wall. They're doing me trusting, it's no good at all. Lazy Sunday afternoon, I've got no mind to worry. I close my eyes and drift away. Here we all are, sitting in a rainbow. Oh, blind yellow, Mrs. Jones, how's your bird lumbago? I'll sing you a song with no words and no tune. So sing in your party while you suss out the moon. Oh, yeah! Lazy Sunday afternoon, I've got no mind to worry. Close my eyes and drift away.
I remember going to his flat in Chiswick, and he was telling me then about the problems he was having with neighbours. So whatever he was writing about was all based on real experience, people complaining about the noise. And of course, Steve was a very noisy person. You wouldn't really want to live next door to him, playing records continuously, 24 hours a day, and practising guitar, and he was the ultimate kind of rock neighbour from hell. So he wrote this marvellous little, very funny piece about it. And, of course, Lazy Sunday gets noisier and noisier as it goes on.
It's a real youth anthem in some ways, because, you know, all kids have been, you know, told to turn their music down by the neighbours or their parents. But the thing was, it was a constant in Marriott's life. I mean, he had throughout the Small Faces, he must have had about 20 different apartments. There's one great photo of him where he's sitting outside his flat in Baker Street. He's been kicked out because, you know, he just put on music at 3 in the morning, up loud. And his quote is, Cilla Black lives above me, And you would have thought out of anyone she would have understood, but no, even she was moaning about it.
Here we all are, sitting in a rainbow. Oh, blimey, hello, Mrs. Jones. How's your first lumbago? I'll sing you a song with no words and no tune. So sing in your party while you suss out the moon. Oh, yeah. Lazy Sunday afternoon. I've got no mind to worry. Close my eyes and drift away.
Lazy Sunday is a marvellous sound portrait, really. It's a very, very clever production. Much better than anything the Kinks or the Who might have done. And they were kind of parallel bands at the time, their contemporaries. And some people think that maybe Lazy Sunday is an example of too much of the vaudeville kind of fun aspect of the Small Faces. Maybe people tended to bracket them thereafter as a kind of showbiz sort of group, which is silly, really, because it was something unique and special that only the Small Faces could have done, because they were writing about their own personal experiences, certainly in Steve Marriot's case.
There's two influences on Steve Marriot, which along with R&B, stayed constant throughout his music. One is the musical, which was dying out when he was a kid, but he would have been exposed to. And the second was a knees up, which the family used to do on a Christmas day. They would all gather around the piano. And for that day and that day alone, they would be allowed to sing these kind of songs which are a bit ribald, a little bit, you know, a little bit blue. And this was a Christmas tradition at the Marriott family, which, you know... so obviously Steve had taken those two elements, the musical and, you know, the Cockney knees up, which of course he'd have been exposed to in pubs as well around the East End, and brought that into the music. And because the band were all East Enders, apart from Mac, who was from Hounslow, they responded to this. You know, they thought it would be, you know, really funny. They were an early Chaz and Dave, really, Small Faces, when you think about it, you know.
That was part of him, and that was part of the group as well. They were all, you know, they're all East Enders, and they all must have experienced that sort of sing-along stuff at the local boozer. And so it's very honest. And it may have been flippant. Maybe Steve may have written it flippantly, but who cares? It's still... I still think it's real.
Nothing to say, and no one can stop me from feeling this way. Yeah. Lazy Sunday afternoon, I've got no mind to worry. Close my eyes and drift away. I've got no mind to worry. Close my eyes and drift away. Close my mind and drift away. Close my eyes and drift
away. Lazy Sunday. The Small Faces' new album is one of the most idiosyncratic records on the market. It's called Ogden's Nut Gone Flake. It's packed in a circular jacket, and one side of the record is taken up entirely by a musical narrative called Happiness Stan. It's a kind of fairy story for our time. The Small Faces supply the music, and the storyteller is that master of gobbledygook, Professor Stanley Unwin.
Now, like all fairy stories, this one begins once upon a Tyto. And Happiness Stan, whose whole life symbolized by the multicoloured radiate and scintillate of the multi of the rainbow, lived in an ancient Victoriana charabanc. And this is the old type, sit up and beg, rotate, poppy poppy, with solid wheels all rotated there, very flat, even to squash your toe neighbours. Oh yes. Now, he had a great problem, because when Stan looked up in the heavenly abode as evening approached, he saw this half moon and dangly there and thought, oh dear, where has escaped and gone or stolen, strayed and begged this other half of the moony most? Oh dear. So he put his eyes down and walk it, ploddy through the forest, thinking to himself, oh folly for this other half moon, oh dear. Where at, man, he thought, where at, oh dear.
Ronnie Lane had written this fairy tale about a guy called Happiness Stan. and his quest for searching for the missing side of the moon. Lovely songs, and some lovely instrumentals, but they needed somebody to narrate the story, and the band's first choice was Spike Milligan. They were all big fans of Spike Milligan. Spike Milligan was a fairly obvious choice, of the time. But Spike Milligan wasn't interested. Spike was approached and dismissed it straight away. So who do we get now?
We got Stanley Unwin. Wonderful stuff. I did get to a bit of a recording that he was doing with it, actually. It was quite funny because he'd been there the previous day, and when he came back, he was talking like they were. He'd picked up little bits of their kind of like banter and words that they were using and turned it into absolute gibberish, far out and all, but I can't do a Stanley Unwin, but far out and the greater lobes of your innermost, you just make absolute nonsense out of it, cool man and things like that, Had everybody in the studio falling around on the floor.
So it was all happy Dale, workload and read the newspaper loadie off that. And they had a wonderful party. The fly did a buzzy most round the ceiling. Little boy Blue came and left his hormones behind and stuffed his corn there with his trumpet and brought his melotropy. Oh dear, knees up Mother Brodie, Huckleberry my thimble, and he freaked them all out with an enormous mind blast. Oh dear. And then for the cool of the early morn they gathered there and snooze him over. But stay cool, man, stay cool.
Small Face's biggest success record-wise was the Ogden's Nut Gone Flake album, which is just as legendary these days for its round sleeve as the actual music itself. The boys decided that they wanted it to look like a tobacco tin, and Ogden's Nut Brown Flake was one of the popular tobacco brands of the day, and the guys themselves actually sent away to the tobacco factory asking them for designs of their tobacco tins, as they wanted to base the new album around it. Obviously, Ogden's Nut Brown Flake ended up as Ogden's Nut Gone Flake, keeping with the times and other substances. And that was basically how the idea of the album come about. I mean, there was problems with the round sleeve. I know lots of shops used to complain about it because it used to roll off the shelves. But the fact that it was round got it noticed.
I think Ogden's had some great moments on it, but because it had the round sleeve and because it was a concept album, which was a fresh idea at the time, even though it's only the second half of the album which deals with the concept, which is about a guy called Happiness Stan looking for the other half of the moon. I think it's an uneven album, to be honest with you, I think that they'd kind of exhausted their palette. I think that all those elements I was talking about earlier, musical, knees up, R&B, pop, maybe a bit of folk, all those elements that they'd kind of used up, and this was their last, they after Ogden's they would have to have gone somewhere completely different, because I think they'd used up, their musical sources.
The band were, however, to release one final official single, the enigmatic The Universal.
The Universal, I remember the first time I heard that when I was reviewing singles for Melody Maker and thinking, what on earth is Steve doing with this track? Which sounds like he's recorded it in his back garden with a cassette tape recorder, which I believe he did.
I have a funny feeling I actually heard The Universal being recorded. I went down to some house that they had, or Steve had, and he was out in the garden with his guitar and a tape recorder. And I think he was doing The Universal then. And the dogs were, as they are on the record, yapping about. And I just sort of caught the end of it. I didn't know what he was doing until it sort of came out much later.
The Universal was a classic piece of Marriott perversity. They just had this huge hit single. So what does he do? He gets a little tape recorder, sits in his garden, dog barking in the background, and takes it to the rest of the band and says, "Here, I think we've got a next single."
Such a lot of yet. I hate to tell them sorry, but I haven't got the money anymore. Just for today, I thought I'd leave love alone, hold hands with day. And if I'm so bad, why don't they take me away?
Actually, in retrospect, it's grown in kind of appeal over the years. It's now probably, amongst Small Faces aficionados, it's one of their favourites because it's so off the wall and odd and peculiar. And it has this lugubrious kind of trombone solo in it and a clarinet as well, which all forms part of Steve's little ditty about who he is and where he is and his role in the universe.
The second part of the song was actually played in the studio. And the guitar part, and it's almost a rockabilly-style chordal part. And it shouldn't fit together, but it does, and it works really well.
And Marriot was really hurt it wasn't a hit. To him, it was the best thing he'd ever done up until that point. And he still was kind of harping on about that in later life, you know. And it's just weird that you would think that, that he would think it was such a great hit single, that it should have been massive, where, you know, it's more like a B-side than anything. But this is where he was at, you know, to record in the garden, you know, his wife coming home with the shopping, the dogs barking, you know. And that's where he was at, you know, this is what I've come up with, right, get it out, this is where I'm at musically, you know, not, you know, is it well structured, has he got a riff, has he got a chorus, this was just in going, this is where I'm at, you know. And I think it's a shame that they split up at that point, because I think there was some intriguing pointers to where they could have gone with the group. But basically, Marriott wanted to bring in a guy called Pete Frampton on guitar, the other band members didn't want to. They got commissioned to record and write with a French actor, a French singer called Johnny Halliday. After Ogden had come out, they went over there in summer of '68 and recorded this, did about 3 or 4 songs with him, with Frampton. Glyn Johns, who'd gone there, said all he remembered about the sessions was them just arguing all the time. It was obviously all falling apart. Pimlico was now gone, they'd all moved into their new places. Steve and Ronnie were sharing a flat, Beehive Cottage, up in Essex. And I think they were floundering. They were really, you know, Marriott wanted to go one way, the others didn't. The inevitable happened.
The crunch really came at a gig on New Year's Eve 1968 at the Alexandra Palace in London. The Small Faces appeared there with on an all-star cast, and Steve actually was so disgusted with the sound, they were having amplification problems that night, that he actually threw his guitar to the ground and walked off stage, leaving the rest of the guys to struggle on to the end of the set. That was basically the end of the band, you know. I mean, Steve just stormed out of the building and went down the pub.
Although there were posthumous singles and albums and even a reunion during the 1970s, it is the run of singles spanning the years 1965 to 1968 that still remain among the most vibrant and influential records in British pop.
Well, it's amazing. I mean, if you listen to the first single, What You Gonna Do About It, and listen to the last one, The Universal, it's a complete two different You know, it shows you what the journey has been.
Hey, Steve, what you going to do about it?
I want you to know that I love you, baby. I want you to know that I care. Yes, I'm so happy when you follow me, but I'm sad when I say, sing the song now.
The Small Faces basically burnt so much creativity in such a short time. When you think that the Beatles took 4 years from Please Please Me to Revolver to get to... The Small Faces did it within 11 months. And that is what is so unique about them, that they blazed their way through their career. And it was only right in some way that they did burn out at the end. They compressed it all into 3 short, remarkable years.
There's a great interview that Marriot did in '68 on Radio 1. 67 or 68. He's asked about Itchycoo Park and how they got the phasing on the record. He went, "Oh, it's simple. I pissed on the tape." I mean, you've got to love a guy like that, haven't you?